Chapter 6. Nothingness shrouded Valorian, providing him with the escape he had wanted, begged, and eventually crumbled to receive. Relief flooded through him at the absence of the torment and pain that had set upon him. He wanted nothing more than to be here for all eternity, away from all suffering. Why did you lose? No voice attached itself to the question, no character but Valorian's own was in the words to give the question presence, and yet, the question was not his. What? Valorian thought, floating in utter emptiness with no mouth to speak with. Why did you lose? The question appeared in Valorian's thoughts again. Lose? Valorian pondered before images exploded in flashes through his mind. Barrage after barrage of the beast playfully striking him. The helplessness relived. The lack of power and strength to change the course of events set against him. Why did you lose? The voiceless voice persevered. I don't understand why. I don't understand why I've to fight it in the first place. What did it accomplish to do so? What will it accomplish even if I win? I just want to be left alone, away from everything. Why did you lose? The voiceless question echoed through his mind, becoming insistent on an answer. I guess I'm not fighting it the right way. Mind over matter, that's this world, nothing has a physical presence. So I have to use my mind to fight it, not my imagined muscle, Valorian offered. Why did you lose? The voiceless voice repeated once again. Why? Why? I don't know why. I have no answers. Why am I here? Why am I the way I am? I don't know what I'm meant to do, never mind why I should do it. Purpose then. A purpose drives the lion, what drives you? The voiceless voice counter-argued. I don't know. Love, peace, happiness, Valorian mused in reply. To what end? The voiceless voice asked. Them themselves. They are the conclusion. Attaining them is the end, Valorian surmised. The end? Is love eternal? Is peace an absolute? What is happiness without suffering to give you distinction? What greater truth can you discover in such earthly devices? How do you find purpose amongst mere worldly distractions? The voiceless voice retorted. Having them in your life is the purpose, isn't it? Are they not the pursuits of righteous men? Valorian argued. Do the depraved not covet such as to love? Is not the sinister at peace reveling in wickedness? Should you not applaud the villainous for causing suffering that will give disparity to kindness? The voiceless voice answered. Then. What? What is my purpose? Valorian screamed in thought, bidding for a reply in the darkness of his consciousness. But there was only silent emptiness where the words had come to him before. What is my purpose? Why is trying to be a good man so inadequate? Why? No silent whispers replied. Valorian? A hand shook his shoulder. Valorian, it's over, son. A murky voice guided Valorian back to consciousness. What happened? Valorian demanded, sitting up dazed. The lion. He answered his own question as his thoughts stumbled upon reason once again. The view before him shimmered and warped. The shift in location becoming apparent with Valorian transported from his vantage point during the battle to a dark white hall. Thick wooden rafters ran the hall's length and breadth, with squared wooden struts as pillars. Bulky woolen rugs carpeted the front of the hall centering on a platform, on which sat a series of wooden chairs. Valorian ran his eye over them, his mind tried to place them in one of the rooms in Cradle. He looked at the furniture, hoping to recognize the craftsmanship, but the large central chair had bulky carvings on both the backrest and armrests that lacked the refinery of an elf's work. Even its placement was devoid of an elfin thought, with the chair placed to captivated the entire hall to its prominent position. It was an inequitable thing of showy power that imbalanced the room. Valorian looked for other clues around him as his father's imprint waited. Above the throne area, a banner hung between two of the wooden pillars. Concentrating on the sight helped Valorian focus properly as he scanned the depiction of a mighty king surveying his seaside kingdom. It had ships and birds that sailed and flew on the right whilst small figures stood scattered around a castle that flew the coat of arms of a golden eagle with its wings extended. Valorian's arm nearly tried to grab his missing transcendent sword from his waist as he suddenly saw the empty suits of armor that hung on stands for decoration around the walls, each gilded and lacquered in gold and rich shellac colors. His encounter with the lion made him take note of all the shiny swords, shields, spears, and axes that overlapped each other as they dangled on the whitewashed paneling. He might have need of the weapons if the lion returned, and he made note of the biggest and heaviest amongst them. The hall's windows let in a sliver of light through the small glass panes that ran along the top of the walls in latticed groups. There was not much light in the hall, but he felt he could manage enough to defend himself. It was a place of importance, but paled compared to the simplest reception halls in the meekest elfin abode. Valorian and his father's imprint were alone in the barren hall. He looked about him as he stood taking in his new setting. Jonvin patiently waited for Valorian to complete his inspection. "I must get out of here. Surely my parents provided for a way out?" Valorian asked as he turned to the imprint of Jonvin. Taking hold of Jonvin's imprint, Valorian pulled him intrusively towards him. "We did, but not until," the imprint of Jonvin said pensively as he disappeared from in front of Valorian to reappear further into the hall, free from Valorian's imposing grasp. "Well, speak of it. No more games. I will endure no more of this nightmare," Valorian demanded, with his tone equal parts forcefulness and pleading. "Please help me," he said, his body slumped in submission. "I am unable to assist you until you overcome your primitive side. If I could I would, for although I am only a mere impression of your father, I have in me all the aspects he considered important. All his aspirations for you reside in me. To see you safe, happy, and well, but it is not possible for anyone to help you in this because you are the keeper of this environment. The concept your mother and I created has long since collapsed. This world is of your making, whether you are conscious of that fact or not," Jonvin said, walking back over to Valorian to rest his hands on Valorian's shoulders. He dipped his head forward in apology. "Forgive me, Valorian, your mother and I did not want this life for our dearest child, but it was necessary. You are necessary." "How? How am I necessary? What is my purpose?" Valorian asked, reminded of the words from the voiceless voice. "I'm afraid that knowledge is denied to me," Jonvin answered softly. Valorian nodded as he took a deep breath and straightened himself. He had only lived a child's span of years for an elf, but as a man, he had lived a long protracted life compared to a normal human span, and in all that time, he had never felt so vulnerable. Never was he lacking in ability, despite how the elves had tried to train him. Every failed class, every unsuccessful lesson had never been total, for he always had his power awaiting his command. He was finally seeing his own mantle. Stripped of his usual supremacy over the world around him, a pitiful victim lay exposed. "Do you want time to yourself?" Jonvin asked. "No, stay," Valorian replied, nodding to him and placing an empty smile on his face to alleviate Jonvin's concerns. "Is this in the city? Clendoran's palace?" "We're in the city, but not the palace. This is the conference hall of the city council building. The palace was burnt during the battle," Jonvin responded as he turned to look at the empty throne, a bitter opinion articulated on his face. "How?" Valorian sought elaboration. "Are you sure you wish me to continue with the story?" Jonvin compassionately inquired. "Yes, it may. I don't know. Please just continue," Valorian answered, winding his hand for Jonvin to proceed. "Very well," Jonvin agreed to nod sympathetically. The attack they sent from across the land infiltrated the city, and that, well, it had some ramifications. "The trolls managed to kill the king?" Valorian speculated. That might have been a better thing to have happened, but no. The king's guards eventually bested the few trolls that got past Arabine, getting the fat fool to safety, but not before the trolls managed to set fire to the palace. Which is why we're here. May I present to you the new palace assembly hall of great King Noman Clendoran, Jonvin said, fanning his arm out from corner to corner of the council's conference hall. What ramifications could he lay against you? You defeated an army far greater by number. Was he disappointed by your losses? Valorian's question rebuked the opinion of a long-dead king he had never met. No, he wouldn't release us as he had promised. He believed that we had failed him by allowing his father's palace to be destroyed, and the penalty was our continued service. The reaction we had to that decision made for the ramifications. Do you want to see what happened? Jonvin propositioned. Valorian bobbed his head absently, awaiting the distraction the event might have over his concerns of the lion. Concerns which consumed his thoughts with despair more and more. Light began to radiate through the windows, showering textural colors into the room, giving the environment a vitality. Mostly men, with a few women dotted amongst them, began to materialize around them as the light chased away the shadows. Guards that wore the purple with gold-trimmed tunics of the royal guard appeared at each entry point in the room. 2 guards took up station on either side of the king. The familiar sight of the well-rounded king filled the chair at the front. The other chairs lining the front of the conference hall gradually filled with other noble courtiers. Some wore lavish long robes made from delicate cloth and decorated with a mountainous collection of gold, with rings, amulets, bracelets, earrings, and threaded gold brocade patterns adorning their attire. Despite the well-represented group, they did not have the sheer convenience of available canvas the king possessed, shoehorned into the throne of his father. He sat wearing a newly made armor breastplate coated in plated gold and inlaid with jewels, the rich red fabric on his shoulders plumed out in a puffy exaggeration. Valorian and his father's imprint became intermingled with a crowd of people, ranging in their apparent wealth from those making a fair attempt at kingly embellishment to those that bordered on passably presentable. It was easy to see which men could afford worth and which could not, but Valorian did not judge worth by the amount of coin found in a person's purse. Arabine and Jonvin appeared on the carpet surrounding the platform, mud from their boots marking their route in, directly across the polished wooden floor, and over the rugs. They wore the armor from the battle, with Jonvin's only slightly cleaner than when he had seen it last on the beach. He had half-heartedly removed the dark tar-like blood of the trolls, the metal remained stained black by it. Valorian noticed that all the still inanimate participants were looking directly at the blades. The scene took on more layers of complexity as the memory fully formed. Even the smell became a more elaborate commotion. The years burning animal fat in oil lamps had ingrained the fibers of the wood and cloth with a deep greasy decay. The crowd added a malodorous ruckus of sweet and sour scents to the stable slithering pong, most of the people substituting masking floral scents for a daily bathing. The scene sprung to life, a hustle of a crowd's movement came to bear. Murmurs, heavy breathing, and coughing all made for a silence in its own right, as no one spoke amongst the assembly. The moment held on a pivotal point of an important debate. "It was promised to us by your father, boy," Arabine said with such malice as to not have his resolve questioned. "It was also promised by you. I am the king, you common-born swine. Speak to me like that again and I'll have you flogged. It is for me to take and give your freedom as I choose. As I so choose." "So you think you are a king, do you?" Threat and hostility cavorted on Arabine's words. Kings do not break vows to their subjects. Kings uphold the laws. Kings, Arabine said as King Noman interrupted. Silence. "Enough. That is enough. You peasant!" King Noman shouted frantically, stabbing his finger at Arabine. "You'll do as you're told." "No." Arabine interrupted abruptly. "As commander of King Edan Clendoran's blades, your father's blades, I remove you from your position for breaking your vows to the kingdom. I deem you unfit to be king." "Guards, take," King Nomin began to say. "Silence, you fat pig," Arabian ordered. The air in the room stiffened as every person felt the oppressive authority from Arabian pushing and pulling on them as animus and animu energy emanated from him. Guards from around the conference hall began to move towards them. Drawing the useless sharpened strips of metal, they called swords from their sides. Jonvin stepped forward, halting their steps with fear. His transcendent sword flashed into the air before him. The hall hummed as the blade sang. Jonvin's fiendish gaze darted from guard to guard, the unspoken threat received loud and clear. Jonvin almost snarled a challenge to each of the jester-like protectors to defy him. "As I was saying, from this point on you will be stripped of your office, your lands, your household, and control of the kingdom," Arabian declared with a wicked expression on his face. His head dipped forward, he raised it slowly in a sinister awe to look upon the man sitting abashed on the throne. "Guards, take this. Commoner to the jailhouse." Arabian had played the gambit. It was now in the hands of any who would dare counter the order, or for the guards to outright refuse. The time passed in an uncomfortable hush as a king sat speechless under Arabian's predatory stare. The king nervously fidgeted on the throne. Jonvin stood menacingly with his transcendent sword bare, the tone of its song fluctuating as it swayed gently in his hand. "You! Take this peasant from the seat meant for the king," Arabian ordered, pointing to one of the motionless guards mesmerized by Jonvin's sword. The guard did not move. "I said, remove him," Arabian said in a low menacing voice. As he finished his command, the atmosphere buzzed with energy as the guard levitated into the air, the crushing force from Arabian's animus on the verge of squashing the guard's life. "Yes, Lord, I will." "Please," the guard complied, barely able to squeeze out the words through ever-narrowing lungs. The guard dropped to the floor as the doors at the rear of the hall opened, ushering in the remainder of the furious blades into the hall in response to Arabian dream casting a call to arms in their minds. "Sir Trox, help the royal guard remove this dandy fool from the court to the jailhouse, where he belongs," Jonvin commanded, pointing his sword at the former king, the transcendent sword's song becoming a metal whistle when it had the fragile once king in its bladed sight. The rest of the assembly watched on as Trox herded the royal guard with their ward kicking and screaming in protest out of the hall's back entrance. Trox's physical presence, and sheer brutish dominance, were more than enough to sway influence with the guard for cooperation. One of the older men within the collection of advisors, stationed along the platform, stepped forward. "We cannot sanction this action, Sir Arabian," he stated with more assuredness than Valorian thought he should have had, given his obvious inability to enforce his words. "Do not presume to think I need such sanction, Councillor Baroon. My blade is the only endorsement I need," Arabian said, not even making an effort to look towards the court councillor. "Now take a seat. I have removed a king from power today, a vacancy in the courthouse will not cause many more ripples." Councillor Baroon delicately retook his seat as the blades casually walked around the room, a pack of predators stalking a herd. The fearful audience reflexively bunched together as they flocked to a silent attention on Arabian. The rule of an inadequate fool has ended this day. Do not miss it, for it was lacking quality and value in its administration. A son inherited a kingdom, taking the works of his father and leaving them to waste and decay. A king of worth is needed. Arabian turned around the hall as he engaged them all in his words. A king who will face the task as the great King Edon Clendoran did. I see not one here with the requirements and so will appoint blades to the task of officiating, until an appropriate successor can be established. Councillor Baroon sprang from his seat as if stung by the offense. "Now just you wait. Blades can't possibly perform the duties of a king and there are proper methods to uphold when choosing a king, methods of tradition that even the king must respect. Councillor Baroon said as he once again stood before Arabine, distinguishing himself from the nervous crowd, marking him from the herd in the eyes of the carnivorous blades. The councillor's hands came up as he pointed at Arabine, marking Arabine's derisible look. He worked his hands into meekly unhostile positions. The matter of choosing a successor must be done by following the appropriate procedures. And these procedures, they were in place when the son was sanctioned by this court to succeed his father many years ago. Arabine showed little interest in the argument. He seemingly focused on an inspection of the ceiling, occasionally eyeing Councillor Baroon without actually giving him any regard. Jonvin began examining his sword and testing the flat of the blade. The belittling posture and intimidation had an effect as the councillor became more visibly deferential. Baroon paused to consider an answer that might see him survive this day. There. Traditional procedures were followed. Then the procedures that would see a buffoon seated on the throne are flawed and will need to be changed to provide the people with the best possible representative to conduct their lives. Will they not? Arabine posed. It was not a true question and carried with it a penalty for any contradiction. Jonvin finished his scrutiny of the sword, seemingly content. He locked his damning gaze on the councillor with all his veritable appraisal pressed upon the councillor as he waited for a response. With his chin brushing across his chest, the councillor swiveled his head side to side as he looked for support out of the corners of his fearful eyes. All his peers looked away from him or shuffled from view. Each denied him any support. You are of course correct, Sir Arabine. We'll await your instruction as to the changes to be made, Baroon responded, managing to dip forward a little further in a bow. Deliver any matters of importance to Sir Islam, he ordered, pointing to a slender blade, not well placed in the forbidding armor of the furious blades, who stepped forward. Then enough talk, be about your work. Arabine started to the conference hall door. He paused calmly as he waited for the large double doors to open. Jonvin remained for a few moments looking at the cowering group of courtiers and noblemen. He flourished his sword, whipping it around his left side and then his right, the sound of the swiping transcendent blade making the startled onlookers gasp and cringe by the sudden instabilities in their own mortality. He finished the maneuver with his sword sheathed as he twisted to be underway behind Arabine, who was waiting at the entrance for Jonvin to join him. The rest of the blades made their way to the gathering and followed behind Arabine and Jonvin as they swept aside the scuttering servants and lackeys. The column of blades marched down the narrow hallway with such authority the very building seemed to tremble. Valorian and his father's imprint stepped into the hallway after them, watching them depart out of view. Was another king ever raised to the position? No, Jonvin answered. The kingdom began to break down after a year or so. Most moved away in the night to start new lives. Arabine didn't mind. He openly endorsed it, seen it as a cleansing of the weak. His main concern at the time was replenishing the blade ranks. So, he took control of the kingdom. Did he make himself king as well? Valorian asked as he took several strides towards the archway leading to a small overhanging balcony placed opposite the conference hall entrance. No, but only because he believed it was beneath him, Jonvin explained. In place of a king, ministers and so-called people's representatives were used to afford Arabine influence, without accountability. When something went right, it was Arabine's doing, and when it went wrong, well, he had a token leader to behead. No one could oppose his rule. The blades supported him fanatically and made sure each and every one of his wishes became history for the scribes. Neither elves nor dwarves, giants, avines, dragons, and nary all manner of intelligent beasts and elemental spectres could stop his influence. He extended territory by placing it under the protection of the furious blades. The people welcomed it. Arabine could provide safety from forces more powerful than any normal man could face. Valorian nodded with a flat smile, but his mind was losing interest in the distraction offered by the story. He walked to the balcony guardrail and leant on it whilst his gaze swept across the length of the kingdom. Despite all before him, he could only see his own problems and was forced to admit he could no longer ignore his current dilemma. As his head dipped he breathed in deeply, looking for strength from the formless air, but it was no more real than the act of breathing here. He suddenly felt like he was going to lose his identity here, all his confidence in his abilities, the assurance in his actions. Doubt and skepticism peeled back the fickle defenses that had served him so well through his life. Jonvin joined him on the balcony as Valorian pushed himself upright only to practically collapse backwards against the wall. He took a long dragged-out inhalation through his nose and released it in a slow deflation as he scraped down the wall to flop to the floor. The reenactment of the past was over, and Valorian's own concerns reclaimed his thoughts with a crushing force. Jonvin withdrew slightly to the hallway, just under the arch. For most of his life, Valorian had always had the upper hand. Physically and mentally he had just functioned impeccably when no elfin technique got in the way. His abilities were like breathing or a heartbeat, they functioned naturally without conscious effort on his part. That was not the case here. Rather than regarding his performance in achieving tasks and superiority against elves, he had to compete against that very persona within him in which all his natural talent lay. Valorian turned his head round slightly, but kept his eyes on the floor. I guess sooner or later I'll be left to the mercy of that beast again? Jonvin remained silent, treading softly as he came to Valorian's side. Crouching, Jonvin placed a hand on Valorian's shoulder. Do not lose help to this son. There is much that has need of you. If that is so, then what is that need, father? What purpose did you and mother have in mind when you created me? Valorian asked. Jonvin smiled at Valorian as he released a whimpering laugh under his breath. Ha! You must think as grand architects indeed. We had no other purpose than to have a child. We came to love each other, even after so many atrocities had taken place. Mile wanted a child, so we set about making a way to do so. Never before has an elf and human produced offspring. It was believed to be impossible, until you. Mile found a way. Because I was a dream weaver, we could make a union possible, but no matter how much we attempted to control the conception. Well, the result. You. Became much more than we had prepared for. The Nexus. Valorian said, his head turned to face his father's crouched form. You mentioned it in your message. Yes. That was what was so unexpected about your conception, Jonvin explained as he rolled back and took a seated position on the flooring of the balcony. As he did, the environment around them took on a feel of great solitude. The manufactured noises of the recreated city lost the industrial hustle to take on an eerie stillness. In a gradual fade, the generated inhabitants disappeared. I'm sorry to say that I have only limited knowledge of what she did, but it involved very convoluted elemental balancing that resulted in you deriving your power from a field of energy which bisected a singularity, a dimensional convergence point. Every time you draw upon your strength, it is pulled through some infinite continuum. She herself didn't understand it completely, it was just the energy level you naturally occupied, the Nexus, Jonvin explained with a warm smile as he looked down at the floor. His gaze focused on a distant memory of his beloved wife Mile. I used to catch her talking to you in her belly. She would talk about the sights she would show you and the things she would teach. I had my doubts, we knew so little about how you were able to exist after all. I wasn't sure you would, or even could be born. But Mile, she was just so confident, so resolved. I repeatedly asked her how she could be so sure, trying to prepare her in part for disappointment, but she wouldn't hear any of it. She would say, a mother knows such things. Jonvin laughed as he met Valorian's gaze. You have her eyes and the same cleverness that filled them. I really wish you could have known her, he declared, a flat mournful smile given to Valorian that held within it 1,000 missed moments of affection. Yes, that's a wish I would encourage, but if wishing were possible, I would wish that you both had been there in my life growing up, Valorian said, bringing his knees up to his chest and repositioning himself to better face Jonvin. Can you tell me all you do know about what was done, that is to say, the construction of this lion and the Nexus? The why of it at the least? I will try, but you must understand I'm just a fragment of my former self, a fraction of the overall form that was your father. Some memories come easily, others are gaps, intended or otherwise, Jonvin informed as he brushed his index finger across his pouting upper lip, wagging the finger at Valorian when he came to a conclusion. Although, Mile always said that it was as if your formation itself took on a will of its own. When we first began to take steps to your conception, the biomechanical necessities were easily overcome. The difficulty lay in constructing a concept to contain your primitive human side, he said, shrugging his shoulders and tilting his head with a smile. Basically, an elf has pure thought. When an elf thinks, they have a serenity in their thinking. A singular emotion, such as happiness or sorrow, is experienced distinctly and in its entirety, rather than the mix of emotions in the mind of a primitive human. Jonvin chuckled. Which was something your mother repeatedly said, I might add. Jonvin commented fondly. Valorian could not help but smile. She always used to tell me how volatile my thoughts were when we linked minds. The chaos in which a human thinks is anathema to the requirements of an elf. So, we separated all the primitive emotions from your consciousness in order for emerging to be successful, Jonvin clarified. That need resulted in the manifestation of the lion, as the manner and form of that separation? Valorian postulated. In part. Mile's favorite story from her childhood was about this mythical creature that was part elemental spirit and part lion. It would stride across the land doing great deeds, handing out justice and compassion. She talked about it often and it even resulted in your name becoming Valorian. It means great lion spirit in an ancient form of some lost elfish language she knew, Jonvin said as he took a breath and waved that possible tangent story away. The point being, when you were conceived, the partitioning of your consciousness took on a concept of the lion to house the primitive emotions you feel. But, like drawing upon the Nexus energy, that was not our doing, it was you that sought it out in your mother's memories and then constructed it. This was another of the unexpected portions I was talking about. With the power of the Nexus, you were more powerful than us, and we lost all control. In the end, despite our self-belief in our scientific ways of magic, we had as much to do with your conception as the unscientific nonsense that a butterfly could ever cause a hurricane. So what manner of form had you intended? Valorian bid for an answer as his mind began thinking of all the options. None. We had created a simple partitioning that would keep the baser human emotions isolated from your elfin consciousness. That was all, a wall. It was you that gave rise to the embodiment of the lion. The primitive aspect is, and always has been, separate from your consciousness. As blades dream weave more and more, they fuel their subconscious minds to achieve the necessary mechanisms. The subconscious primitive emotions grow stronger and more intense, and eventually they begin to seep into our conscious minds. Fear and want twists and warps the mind until you're consumed by primordial desires. But, in case you think it dims the intellect, don't. It gives an obsessive clarity to your focus. Your path is always clear and your purpose set. Simply, you feel an overwhelming contentment and satisfaction from anything you do, Jonvin admitted as he paused with his thoughts mirrored in his expressions, which beheld all the dark memories in his recollection. In all honesty, the loss of that contentment is the greatest pain. Even as a mere imprint, that aspect to my personality is unflinching. It is so deeply woven into my being, and I would not understand existence without it to define me. And that, with all that intelligence and passion, is what you are facing in this lion. Mile used my fury ring to create this environment so that I would have to confront my anger rationally. The ring concept forced me to relive all the occasions in my life, in which I had given over control of myself to the savagery driving my undeveloped and unbridled subconscious. It forced a confrontation with all the times in my life that my anger had been distorted and wrongly directed. I saw every moment in my memory from a third-party perspective and was then left to fail in rationalizing the consequences on those I should have cared for, but instead hurt. "That must have been very difficult," Valorian remarked, a soft touch of compassion in his tone. It was. The realizations were abhorrent and I detested myself for the things I had done. Mile was there for me even after. Jonvin hesitated, his words cut short as he turned his concentration inwards to reflect on a moment from a past life. "I had to use the ring in this way several times. The simple fact is that unless you are constantly chastised by the truth, the primitive side of earthly thinking always twists your awareness." Valorian stood and offered his hand to Jonvin, who took his hand in support and rose like any elder father might do with his son. Valorian wore his incredulity openly on his face as he tried to develop some kind of reasoning to solve the puzzle. Despite the apparently vexed countenance, Valorian was beginning to see that this was not some maze of thought to unravel, but a simpler thing of discernment and assimilation of that awareness. It was that very simplicity that made it such a difficult testing, because it resisted all forms of negotiation. He fought to understand how he could come to accept something as alien and primitive as the manifestation of the lion. They stepped from the balcony back into the hallway. Valorian began to walk as he thought, Jonvin maintaining a measured pace behind. Occasionally, Valorian would be about to ask a question but stopped, to shake his head before he continued. They walked on in silence. The old wooden floorboards creaked and moaned in a steady complaint as their footsteps padded down the carpeted hallway. As they walked, the corridor led off from the hallway and moved onto a landing with a waist-high wooden railing. Valorian used the metal oil lamp hangers that rose from the top of the wooden posts to help him swing around the corners as they descended the staircases one by one. The wandering ended as they abruptly exited the building onto the empty cobblestone street. The cobblestones were wet and shiny from a fanciful rainstorm some time before the moment was rendered. Glistening streets stretched beyond the pillared gateway to thread into the kingdom. Valorian paused for several moments as he thought to himself. "I will need your help to understand this, but I think I'm beginning to." "I will help in any way I can," Jonvin eagerly agreed. Valorian surveyed the courtyard. Jonvin watched Valorian quietly as he was drawn to the sound of crunching autumn leaves under his foot as he stepped up beside him. He remained silent, not wanting to interrupt Valorian's concentration that worked through some profound calculation. Valorian's eyes danced left to right whilst he muttered, his hands and fingers seemed to conduct an invisible orchestra of unheard revelation. Valorian turned towards Jonvin and burst into his question like he was putting out a fire. "Are you able to describe to me what it was that you learned specifically? From perceiving the events of your anger and the consequences it cost you?" "Ah yes, well now, let me see." Jonvin nearly stumbled over his eagerness to assist. "The hardest step to governing the primitive side is identifying and defining the origin of it. Revealing the real reasoning behind my anger. It differs for all, but for me, I often desired to be superior in a situation. I would try to display the qualities that I aspired to have, but when I was revealed as being anything but ideal, I got angry, very angry, not at myself for my foolishness, but towards that which had revealed the inadequacy. I learned that my actions came through fear of failure or an inability to do the idealistic thing I had wanted. When I got angry at someone, it was normally due to those failings, and I would project my anger onto those people that cast light on my inadequacies." Valorian nodded. "It's about confrontation. You were forced to confront that realization and reject the falsehoods that justified it. I must also confront the lion, but I must understand it rather than reject it." "What do you mean understand it?" Jonvin pressed for greater clarification. It began when I was young. As I grew, so too did the separation between my conscious self and the lion. As you have said, when furious blades dream weave, they gradually forfeit over the control of the world around them to their subconscious. Well, as I have dream weaved, my primitive side, the lion, has been manipulating an environment it was always denied any comprehension of. Dreamweaving anima forms and extending out animus, all whilst senseless to understand the rationale motivating the action. Blind and deaf, in still numbness, it fathomed only raw emotion in infinite black silence. It's as you opined before that elves think with purity, but their own minds don't conflict with the jumbled emotions as mine do. When I experienced an instance such as you described, rather than experience irrational anger as you did, the lion became more prolific in my psyche as the emotion was experienced in its entirety, with no way to understand the source. So we failed you again, John Vin concluded as he cast his gaze down. Instead of protecting your elfish side from the chaos of human thought, we just gave it a plentiful realm to become insurmountable. No. You didn't fail me, nor is the lion insurmountable. How can it be? Valorian questioned. How can a part be greater than the whole? You dealt with your anger by defining the situations in which it had been misused. I must deal with my primitive self by removing the two opposing definitions of my own being. By understanding the reasoning behind the primitive emotions, I should, in turn, reveal the inadequacy in them. Effectively, I have managed my primitive emotions thus far by burying them. The isolation produced rage, because, well, imagine it, able to influence the world it was denied any knowledge of. I suspect even my imagination cannot truly comprehend what I can't comprehend about such a sorrowful thing. You seem to have figured something out, John Vin said as he looked at the empty space before Valorian like it held imperceptible answers that only Valorian could see. I must create a link between my conscious mind and the pure base emotions of the lion. Simply, I must confront the primitive nature there with empathy, so that it, rather than I, can understand me. As you have proven, the primitive desires and wants can be exposed to reason by providing moral and ethical context for them. I must allow the lion into my thoughts, and as such wed the logic of my lucid mind with the desires of the lion. It would seem to be a simple solution. I must reform the barrier that partitions my elfin and human halves into a link which joins them. The question now is, how to go about it? Valorian cut short his deductive narration as he turned towards the empty courtyard. John Vin drew Valorian's attention by resting his hand on his shoulder. Arabine helped me once when our dreamweaving was becoming more and more sophisticated. He reminded me that it is primarily about the desire and not the complicated constructs and mechanism we form from anima in our minds. What is sometimes missing is a way to stage that desire and activate it whilst in the midst of forming highly complex anima constructs. He taught me a very simple trick, a rhyme we often used. Close your eyes, concentrate on what you want to happen, just the want with no how in it, only want. When you feel sure of that want, then, just count to 3 and know that it shall be. Closing his eyes, Valorian took deep and calm breaths as he closed his eyes and focused on the want. He searched for the lion. It was not a search out and around, but one that was within and about. He extended himself inwardly, for the lion was a part of him, it existed separate from him, but also inclusively because of him. The barrier in his mind became apparent for the first time in his life. A melange of chaotic emotions beyond it, all formed from the rawest animus energy. Valorian focused his want as he pushed against the boundary. He wanted the lion to understand him, and him the lion. 1, 2, 3. Valorian said softly. A feeling of exhilaration, freedom, and wild abandonment swept over and through Valorian. Muscles burned with intense use, as if an adrenaline-charged fever was feasting on every morsel of excitement it could have. The liberty of wild unleashed freedom was intoxicating. A wash of satisfaction came from each impacting jolt, a quaking thunder raged through both joint and bone to fuel the need to chase harder and run faster. The unbounded sensations nurtured a spirit long denied the simplest of expressions. Trees flashed past him in a mad dash. The swift movement caught Valorian's breath as the kinetic surges and tremors coalesced into the lion's vision. He looked out through the eyes of the lion. The lion ran and crashed through the territory surrounding the kingdom of Clendoran, the scene blurred in a shiver of angry awareness as Valorian summoned the beast from its glorious emancipation. Roar! The lion's ferocious harbinger bellowed loudly. Valorian felt the rushing force against his face from the lion's announcement. The lion suddenly appeared in the courtyard. Valorian slowly opened his own eyes. Before him, the unsettling presence of the beast filled the courtyard. Valorian looked at the lion, knowing now what had brought it into being. The titan white lion stood and examined Valorian, its silver mane flowed like metallic flames across its back. The lion's azure eyes looked directly at Valorian and would not offer even a blink of mercy for the intrusion. Valorian stared right back without flinching. The lion's eyes began to swirl as an angry tempest formed with Valorian held steady in the center. Valorian's eyes held the lion's in a deadlock, the two sets of eyes became reflections of the same storm. Valorian felt the barrier as it began to reshape. Parts broke down completely as others formed unbreakable links to bind the two together. Gradually, what was once two things merged into one, like the mixing of waters poured into a single vessel. The leaves at Valorian's feet began to rustle and skip along the cobblestones. A surge of wind brushed them into the air and sent them twirling around the walled enclosure. The layers of the barrier cascaded away to release the primitive savagery beyond. With each layer of psychic cording that peeled away, so too did the savagery diminish as the fractured entity healed from the imprisonment. The structures around their large courtyard trembled, the cobblestones cracked as energy swirled and flared around them. Phantasmic mists radiated in a dazzling light as the lion and the frail human became the epicenter of the reeling world generated by the Fury Ring. Brickwork crumbled as roofs collapsed. A vortex filled with the rubble and dust that swept into the cyclonic force. Valorian lifted into the air and moved towards the lion, which struggled to escape the situation. Closer and closer the two became as the world around them ripped into tiny particles. A maelstrom of matter and light formed around the brilliant brazen figures of the lion and Valorian. The two physiques became indistinguishable in size and intensity as they slowly melted together. They faced each other, a lion and a man, both separate and yet both the same. Valorian looked the lion in the eyes. "We apparently have a purpose, you and me," Valorian said to the lion, "and we shall discover it together." The particles of the generated reality revolved faster and faster until the scene flashed to utter white in a detonation of pure luminescence. The blinding light dimmed as the world generated by the ring faded to obscurity. The ring-generated environment released its grip on Valorian's anima and freed him. Darkness followed. "I'm so proud of you, son. Your mother's love and mine will always be with you." "Always," John Vin's voice said in delight. The voice of his father spoke as if in a rushing wind, ever falling further away from Valorian's ears.